Today I have my good friend Mike Regnier here. Welcome, Mike.
Hey, good morning.
How are you today?
Doing fantastic. It's finally summer in Minnesota, so I'm not complaining.
Absolutely. I have Mike here today to talk about building a private equity revenue engine. And Mike, acting as a fractional chief sales officer, is going to help us create a blueprint for SaaS founders preparing for a private equity investment. Mike has been a good friend of mine for many years, both personally and professionally. Has acted as a partner and chief sales officer at Chief Outsiders and a founder for Sales Design and Delivery. For over 25 years, he has entered several successful exits, including IPOs and strategic acquisitions, by installing repeatable revenue engines in healthcare and SaaS firms. I know I'm focused on SaaS firms, and that's where we're taking our conversation today. Mike has worked with companies from all sizes, whether they be under 150 million or all the way up to Fortune 500 companies. Most recently, he has acted as the SVP for sales for 6 Greater Sum Ventures portfolio companies, where he's doubled annual recurring revenue in just 13 months. Mike, before we dive into today's topic, let's talk a little bit about that one engagement for Greater Sum Ventures, because I have a portfolio company that is part of their universe, and I'll tell you a little bit about that after you tell me about this particular engagement.
Yeah, no, they had looked me up through my sales design and delivery consulting firm, and they basically approached me and said, we have a portfolio of 6 companies that we've acquired, all in the skilled nursing and software industries, and they wanted to do cross-selling between those companies and just build synergies between a bunch of $10 million acquisitions they'd made. And so I came on board, and that's really where I kind of came to see the power of fractional management, because I would work 5 to 8 hours a week with each of those 6 companies. And between myself and the CEO that managed the same portfolio for Greater Sum Ventures, we just installed the kind of sales processes we're talking about today, and it had just incredible lift. So again, not any magic bullets, just some good processes that a lot of founders weren't aware were there to be leveraged.
Great. Well, Greater Sum Ventures rolled up one of my portfolio companies, TimeSolve, into a legal tech platform by the name of ProfitSolve. And I helped TimeSolve grow substantially, and then Greater Sum turn that into part of a platform for the legal tech community. So I'm familiar with Greater Sum Ventures. Good guys, a lot of success, and fun to hear of your involvement with them. Hey, people talk about how important a initial meeting and an initial kind of feel for a project goes, like meeting somebody for the first time. When you step into a new engagement, what do you look for right off the bat? Whether it be that first hour meeting, whether it be your first day on the job, or once you have a little bit of time under your belt, whether it be a week or a month. But how do you start looking at a company for that new engagement?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The reason I originally founded my consulting company back in 2012 is the number of private equity investors I'd worked with in successful exits said, you have this sales toolkit that we'd like to just install in each of the companies we're investing in. And the kit that they were referring to is really first coming in and just speaking with the founders about what has been their go-to-market value proposition. What do they think is the why that somebody is purchasing their product for, and then try and look from a solution selling and kind of challenger sale aspect as to how that can be bolstered. And then looking at the sales support materials and see if it contains that kind of concise messaging, because I think we all agree, especially in the world of SaaS, there's just a lot of noise out there, and you really have to spend some time making sure that your value proposition is designed to rise above that noise and really solve a problem, because otherwise you get a lot of meetings, but not a lot of revenue. Then really getting in and kind of rolling up your sleeve and pressure testing all of that. So you're looking at the messaging and seeing if it's truly maximized and optimized. You're looking at the pricing model to make sure that people are able to access you at the highest volumes you could and at the greatest profitability you could. And then really the customer acquisition process as well. How easy is it for your prospective customer to do business with you? I mean, do you need to look in some of the earlier stages of SaaS, doing some pilots? I've done a lot of what I've called innovation partnership programs, where you make somebody that's an early adopter feel special because they're helping you refine your go-to-market and that you're giving them some kind of incentive to partner with you as you do it. So a lot of those kind of initial, how are we engaging with the customers and what are we saying to make sure that we rise to the top of their list is critical in those first days. And then you really have to step back and start building your hiring profile based on that and say, okay, if that's our go-to-market message, what type of rep are we going to need to articulate that? And if we're going to get that kind of rep, what kind of comp plan are we going to need to build to hire and retain them? And then you start talking just about processes, really not only for getting prospective new clients, but the last thing I always ask in my early days of an engagement is what are you doing with your current clients? Because you'd be surprised how many companies are not tapping the easiest revenue that comes from dealing with people you're already doing business with and finding ways to expand your product line and expand their utilization of it. And so building in, business review processes and things that have kind of a customer service feel where you say, hey, Rick, we just wanted to touch base and make sure we're taking good care of you, which everybody welcomes. But after the first 15 minutes of that kind of meeting, you can transition to, and did we let you know that we've now got these 3 additional products that might be worth your team's consideration? And you turn the back half of the meeting into expansion type stuff. And you'd be a little bit surprised how many small companies don't have those kind of fundamental processes in place.
Is there a common theme to kind of the most common mistake? I know for myself, when I'm talking to a founder and I've started to focus on the SaaS businesses for about 10 years or so now, often when they're trying to raise money, a common mistake they make right off the bat is overvaluing what they have. And so the valuation is kind of a easy way for me to say, hey, are they realistic or kind of head up in the clouds a little bit. But is there something that you see on a go-to-market or sales strategy that's a common mistake that you often come across?
Yeah, in sales, it's really interesting because I would say for sure 75% or more of the companies that I engage with, and I average probably 3 or 4 clients at a time for durations of 6 to 12 months, but the vast majority of them are kind of stuck doing it the way that got them to the level of the success that they're currently enjoying, but they haven't done a lot of analysis to say what else could be done to really kick this into 5th gear. And that's really where Greater Sum Ventures, that was the entire process of getting their doubling of ARR in 14 months was we just talked to all of those founders and said, we realize that for the last 6 or 10 years, these have been your processes and this is how you got to this level of success. But have you considered these additional process steps to really kind of juice where you could be in the marketplace? And again, we all get familiar and you'll get up and go in 65 days a year and you get used to doing it one way. And so bringing some fresh eyes, particularly with sales and marketing kind of go-to-market analysis can really help get people to that next level.
So it sounds like in a way you're describing that founder selling, that hero selling methodology. So you're trying to bring, in essence, at a high level, you're trying to bring system and structure to what they're doing to try to make it more repeatable versus relying so much on the founder.
Yeah, exactly. And you look for ways, frankly, that you get to a better result more easily. And that's where a lot of these sales processes that, to be honest, I come into these organizations and I do some pretty basic sales process things and they think I'm an absolute genius just because as founders, they've never had access to that before. And so it's like a doctor coming in with penicillin. Everybody thinks that you're some kind of god, and it just turns out there's medications people weren't aware of,
You've had a lot of experience growing companies, big and more middle market. Clearly, evidence-based positioning can boost valuations and shorten the diligence process with private equity firms. How do you go about pressure testing messaging so that it survives the private equity firms' customer reference calls and the diligence that they perform?
Yeah, a lot of that's done before we get to the discussions with private equity. When I'm engaged with the company, in fact, I've been engaged by some large companies like Wolters Kluwer, to actually come in and create and pressure test messaging. So, for example, Wolters Kluwer Health had very large investments in a SaaS piece of software that would work with Epic Healthcare Systems, which is the market leader in the hospital systems. And they bought me in because they wanted to circumvent the 200 reps they had in the field where they knew they couldn't get reliable pressure testing, because some would say this is the cat's pajamas and some would say this is worthless. And they wanted to have me work with their physicians and actually bring it out to market in a way that we could meet weekly and say, hey, we went out, we gave this messaging to a chief medical officer at this given system, and lo and behold, 70% of this resonated, 30% didn't quite land the way we thought. How are we going to iterate on that 30%? And then I'd go out and re-pressure test it. And once we'd done that to a point where we had it scalable, I'd hire an East and a West Coast VP of sales, and they'd go out and take that same repeatable process and do it. And once we had them successful, we'd drive it down and start hiring reps. And so by the time you get to talking to private equity and so forth, a lot of what they're going to be checking into has already become part of your successful go-to-market package. And so there shouldn't be a lot of concern at that point that they're going to find some skeletons, because you built your whole sales approach on making sure that you're maximizing the value of your messaging.
So tying this question into the prior one, where what we're really talking about is these companies trying to move from a founder and that hero selling to something that's more scalable, and creating the process and the messaging that work to do that. Expand a little bit, because I think this is very important for the folks that are out there listening. Where do founders help or actually hurt the sales process, the sales motion, and the sales momentum?
It's interesting because, to put it succinctly, you don't know what you don't know. When founders have been doing something for 8 or 10 years and it's been successful, they tend to think that's the way to do it. And it's certainly a way to do it. And it's been a way to get them to the level that they're ready for the next step. But you'd be surprised how often you walk into an organization and there's some very obvious things that could be done to, increase the efficiency by 40%. An example I'd give you is a client I've been working with recently in Boston was acquired by a PE firm, and it's a 75-year-old company, but it was founder-led for the last 17 years, and very, very much a lifestyle company where they just kept turning the dial and growing at 15% a year, but not really too worried about accelerating beyond that. And of course, the private equity firm wanted to more than double that growth. And so coming in, I just looked at their pricing structure, and they were consistently, their sales force was just calling into management and saying, hey, our competitors in at Barnes Jewish Christian, and they're at 30% off. So what can we do? Can we be at 32? And I kind of started co-traveling with their field sales managers and some of their rep force, and just trying to understand whether they were really out there selling the full value of the organization. And it turned out that there was an opportunity with that organization to actually sell the total cost of ownership instead of just the acquisition cost. And that transformed the entire organization, because people were like, well, I had no idea that you could buy from a competitor thinking you're saving $10,000 on a unit, and then end up spending $130,000 in increased service and parts for the following X number of years. And so just bringing that to light and getting a database of information that you could share with customers so they could make an educated decision really transformed that process. And then we stepped in, and the founders had traditionally then just done line item pricing. And I said, well, if we're going to get people to consolidate their purchasing to us, let's give them some tiered pricing and put some structure to this. So the more they buy, the more they save. So we created a little customer rewards program where the more they directed to us over the course of a 3-year window, the better their discounts would be. And so just some of those kind of standard process packages weren't something that they were aware could help their business. And when you come in and kind of roll up your sleeves and travel around the country for 2 or 3 months and really start to problem solve, it's just great to be able to bring that back to the founders, because they're typically very intelligent people. They just haven't had the luxury of being out and seeing the people that they've been selling to for years, and to be able to hear what kind of problem solving could really accelerate the value of their solution.
Yeah, do you see, because again, this is a big theme that you've seen, I've seen, where people actually get in their own way, if you will. to some degree. Of course, they got the business where they did, but to get it that next level, need to change some things. But do you see kind of a common theme with founders when their personal selling styles are actually hindering scale, getting in the way of it? Any other kind of themes or broad experiences that you've had that are relevant here?
Yeah, the biggest one that I encounter is the founder feeling that since they've been successful selling, that everybody has to be a Xerox of them. Everybody has to do it the way Mike Regnier does it. And I found in being an executive sales manager for 25 years that while you want to have repeatable processes and a kind of a strict go-to-market approach, you want to leave room for Rick to be Rick and Mike to be Mike, because that's how relationships are built and how value is really created as you're interfacing with a client. And so I've seen a lot of founders get very fixated on just saying, no, everybody has to do it the way I've been doing it. And again, because they haven't necessarily had the benefit of other eyes on their process, they don't realize that they're pushing a C+ program and could be duplicating an A+ program.
So that sounds a little dicey, because the founder has been doing it a certain way, and they've been doing it a certain way with a mirror or image of themselves. So there's probably a little ego tied into that.
Yeah.
How do you navigate that and try to tweak it / unwind that way of doing things?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And the short answer is with data, because you're right. If I just come in and say, hey, Rick, your baby's ugly, I don't know how you ran this company the way you did for 10 years, it's not going to go over well. But if I say, hey, Rick, that's terrific. Let me take what you just educated me on and take that on the road for 2 weeks. And let's meet next Friday. And let me tell you what I learned and what went well and what didn't go well. And you'd be surprised how easy it is to kind of assimilate data when you say, really, you talked to 4 different organizations and they said that? I wouldn't have thought that'd be true. But I mean, if you heard that from Microsoft and you heard that from IBM, then we should pay some attention to it. So what I've done is kind of taken the personalities out of it and just made it a data-driven decision by going out and doing that pressure testing we were talking about earlier, because CEOs very much value having factual information. And so it's not a ding to their ego when you go out and say, hey, you'll be surprised, but the market seems to be indicating this. And they say, that's extremely valuable. And you know what, Mike, that's not how I've been doing it. You say, really? And, so you're not having to throw it in their face. You're just giving them the benefit of some market reaction, which is why I created sales design and delivery. It wasn't just designing the sales processes, it was delivering revenue, because until you go out and have to do the job of delivering revenue, you don't know what's missing in your go-to-market.
Hey, when you do that, are there some specific metrics that you lean on more often than not? Are there some key financial drivers that are kind of your favorites? I mean, obviously, every situation is unique. I get that, but you probably pull from a few favorites, I'm imagining.
Yeah, and I mean, they all kind of fall under the category of sales velocity. It's like, how often are we getting into deeper sales stages? When we make our initial qualifying discussion, how many of our presentations are turning into proposals, et cetera? So you can test your messaging quality by seeing how quickly you're advancing a sale. And again, that's just pure data that tells you what's resonating and what's not. And so I think the velocity of that is very germane. And then I think ultimately that the ultimate test is revenue. It's like, are we getting maximum value for this product? Because so many of these SaaS tools that I've been associated with, you come to them with additional versatility in the application that they hadn't necessarily thought of, and suddenly you're unlocking value. To be honest, I was with the SaaS company several years ago, and we were presenting to 3M Healthcare, and the founder came with me, and we made our presentation. And the client at 3M got so excited that I kept the proposal in my bag, and we went back and doubled the price and came back and presented it, and they were happy to accept it. Once you really start talking about what the software technology could do, suddenly the valuation changes at the snap of a finger. So that's really what I've been doing from a process standpoint, is finding ways to increase the velocity and expand the acceptance so that you get more sales quicker at a higher margin.
And then your process, don't want to get off track too far here, but your process, how long does the kind of the front end assessment take? Just asking for a friend.
Yeah, no, typically a lot of my engagements start out at least as 3 months because you can learn an awful lot. One that I started in January was supposed to be a 2 to 3 month engagement with the private equity firm with one of their new acquisitions. And I spent the first 2 months out on the roads with their 3 national kind of regional business directors. So covered the country, met with some of their customers, traveled with some of their service partners, and just asked a bunch of questions over dinner, etc. And then, typically I'll come in and just have a weekly review with the CEO and say, hey, was out and talked to 6 customers this week and wasn't surprised that we heard this, was a bit surprised that we heard that. I'm thinking we might want to adjust accordingly. What are your thoughts? And then you go do it again. And you can learn an awful lot in 3 months just by getting out and taking that kind of sampling. And then typically my clients will engage for another period or two just to deploy the processes that we engineer based on the feedback we get from those initial few months.
Okay. All right. Hey, so if you bounce from there, starting on the front end of the engagement to be when a company is looking to bring in private equity, we've been talking a lot today about the founders doing things a certain way. They've created some success. They feel good about the success that they have created, and now they're looking at bringing somebody else in. So private equity is going to come, look over their shoulder and start digging in maybe a little bit where the founder was off chasing new deals and growing the business and maybe not looking backward and cleaning some things up. What do private equity due diligence teams look for, and where do they usually find skeletons in the proverbial closet as they're doing their due diligence?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I had the good fortune about 14 years ago. We had a company here in the Twin Cities that we sold to private equity, and we actually did it through a bid process. So we had 50 different companies bid, and we met with the top 17. So we got to see 17 different vantage points on that question. And the things that ultimately really added value to the divestiture was that our forecast was very accurate. And that really stems to a very diligent process around Salesforce automation, the pipeline, et cetera. Because the first thing a lot of these private equity firms are going to look for from a sales perspective is, if you get into Salesforce.com or HubSpot or whatever tools are there, first they want to know that you've got that tool. Second, they want to know that you're using it with discipline. And it's pretty easy to look under the hood and say, 20% of their close dates are in the past. They're not paying attention to their pipeline if they've got close dates dating back to April of 2025. And then you get into some kind of deeper stuff around pricing portfolios. I've actually had one private equity firm tell me that when they closed on the deal, they said, if you guys had not been so tight in how you were running your contract portfolios and looking at your favored nations clauses and through purchasing organizations and all those types of things, we would have had to hold back millions of dollars in the purchase price because ultimately we could be liable for those inconsistencies. And so they really want to take a look to see, do you have repeatable processes and are those processes being adhered to with discipline?
Yeah, that's a big thing, that's for sure. Off of the private equity folks digging in, go back like 20, 25 years, and private equity only owned like 5% of the businesses, if that in the country is like 3 to 5%. They now own like 20 to 25%. So private equity financing middle market sized companies is a major trend, not going anywhere. It's going to continue to get bigger given all the money they have on the sidelines. What other things do you see private equity firms looking at when they're deciding whether or not to invest in a business?
I really think scalability is their first concern. It's again, as we talked about earlier, everybody wants to take a look at how the business got to where it is today because, it's been successful enough to attract private equity interest. But then the question becomes, how can that be leveraged and scaled to make sure this really becomes the valuable asset we want it to be? And I think part of what they're looking at there is what we discussed earlier. It's like, is this founder going to get out of the way to allow some of this stuff to happen? It doesn't mean the founder has to go away. It just means they need to be pliable enough to consider other approaches to really putting it from third gear into fifth gear. I think they look as well at the sales organization and say, have the people that have helped this organization been successful, are they going to be willing to A, stick around, B, are they going to be willing to learn new things to really be able to enhance where this organization can go? And so I think it really becomes a question of how do we maximize the potential of this asset? And a lot of that does have to do with the human capital. It's what's the culture, and are these guys going to adapt and become a learning organization so we can go out there and outthink our competitors?
Yeah, I love that, because the companies, once they start growing, and I've seen that in my own portfolio, once they start growing, private equity firms are reaching out and being proactive and actually pretty aggressive in pursuing companies that have demonstrated in the market that they're doing well. And so I think every entrepreneur should be at least considering how a private equity firm would look at their business, even if they're not really thinking about going to market anytime soon. Almost like prepping for the future, even though you don't necessarily know when that's going to be.
Yeah.
Over the years, there's something that maybe is more important to you today than it was, say, 5 or 10 years ago. Is there something that you focus on or pay attention to that's a little different than maybe something you would have in the past?
Yeah, from a sales perspective, it's been really fascinating to watch what data has done to turn the art of sales into the science of sales. It's funny because in my early days of being an executive sales manager with software companies, etc., you'd get in the car in Chicago with the rep that you're co-traveling with for a couple of days, and they're saying, hey, listen, we're going to go see Rick Brimacombe. He loves me. So just talk about his cabin up north, ask about his kids, but don't say anything that might irritate him, because it's all about my relationship with Rick, and that's why he's going to buy from me. And, you may be familiar with a book called The Challenger Sale that was written by Matthew Dixon and became part of Gartner and some other large research organizations. But they actually went out and studied several thousand organizations and said, what is it that you most value from your vendor sales force? And that kind of relationship where Mike and Rick are buddies was actually the lowest category. 8% said, I buy from Mike because he likes my kids. And 60% said, I buy from Mike because Mike challenges me to think differently about my business. He comes in, and frankly, he might even irritate me a little bit because he's suggesting that my competitors are thinking of this differently and you should consider it too. And especially in the world of SaaS, that's been monumental to be able to go in and educate the customer as to how they can think differently to perform better. And now there's a new book actually out called The Jolt Effect, where they've done a study using AI of 2.5 million sales presentations. And they looked at the language in those sales presentations because they were all online. That's how they could study it. And they analyzed what made a sales presentation end up in a ghosting situation, what ended in an elongated sales process, and what ended up in a close. And it was fascinating because the one thing that they were able to ascertain, and it was kind of a accidental finding, is that 38% of all sales or pursuits end up in no decision. That's been known. So your biggest competition as a professional salesperson in SaaS is the status quo. It's people saying, you know what, never mind, we're just going to stay with Microsoft. But in that 38% that leave things as they were, the primary reason is because we get to the end of the sales cycle and you believe Rick in my product, you believe my price is fair, but you start worrying about putting your name on this initiative inside your own organization. And so the art of the deal from a sales perspective, using that kind of science, is to say, what can I do for Rick to de-risk this deal? How can I help him feel comfortable that it is worth pushing through the tape and bringing this change to the organization? Because you're not going to tell me you won't close the deal because you don't want to look bad and it could risk your career. So you're just going to let the status quo reign. You're going to come up with reasons like, we're really busy right now, or the budget's just not as good, or we're concerned about, the current tariff situation, or what have you. But underlying that, the unspoken word that they've been able to find using AI is that there are personal reasons why you're not comfortable pushing something forward. So I've been helping sales organizations look for ways to de-risk those deals to help the decision makers who are not telling you the real reason they're not proceeding, why it is that they should proceed. And it's been fascinating. So that's just been a really neat change in the sales profession. And you really need to help organizations get their salespeople thinking that way from more of a science and human behavior change standpoint than a glad handing, let's take Rick out for a beer standpoint. And that's really revolutionary. And especially in the world of SaaS, it's been extremely effective when you can sell that way.
So playing on the book theme, because I really like what you introduced right there, and I would agree wholeheartedly, old enough to remember the saying, you don't get fired for buying IBM.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of folks out there, especially in a tough, competitive corporate market where people are worried about their position and their job, in addition to trying to do their job. Anyway, you mentioned the book, The Challenger Sale. Do you have other books that you think either executives or CROs should read, books?
Yeah, no, I actually, on the bookshelf behind me, I've got a library that's kind of my training kit whenever I engage with the new organization. And the Challenger Sale that we just mentioned is always one of them, because that's just an entirely new philosophy on how to, do solution selling and really improve things for a customer so they become a partner. The other one I always recommend is Miller Hyman's Strategic Selling. And that's really kind of a sales Bible about how to manage your pipeline so that you don't just get your head down and say, I'm working on this deal with Rick and I'm going to work on it until November. And then I close my deal with Rick and I look up and I've got nothing else cooking. So there's some just good pipeline management and how to kind of keep your activities going as a salesperson. But there's also a lot of information about how to make sure you're getting to all the influencers within an organization, because before the financial crisis, it was proven that usually a VP level executive could make a decision on behalf of a $250,000 SaaS project. Now that's 5.8 people on average on a committee. And so you really need to be able to get around to those influencers and make sure that you're selling and influencing each of them so that you get consensus and get a deal. And Miller Hyman is really good at giving research with strategic selling to help reps do that. The final one that I always recommend is a book called Selling to Veto. And veto is very important, top official. And that's really getting to how you can speak to the executives in an organization, because particularly in the world of SaaS, the value of a lot of these contracts is such that you can waste a lot of sales time talking to decision makers that aren't really decision makers. And they'll spend all the time in the world with you and they'll let you take them to lunch and they'll talk about how great this change is going to be. But at the end of the day, there's a very high percentage of those people who can't get the deal done. And so I've worked with most of my sales organizations to always shoot a couple of level higher in the organization, because once you get executives realizing the potential of what could be done for their organization with your SaaS project, then they're going to push hard on those lower level people to make sure it gets done. And when you circle back to what we were just talking about with the jolt effect research, where people give up on a deal because they don't want to have their name on it, when their COO knows that there's an opportunity to have a $1 million improvement in revenue, they're going to be calling you and say, Rick, have you been working with Mike? Because Mike may be aware that we've got $1 million upside on this thing. And so I want you to make sure you get that new software from Mike. And so having opportunities, there's some really good sales process in the book Selling to Veto that helps you get to executives, not necessarily so you can spend 2 hours selling to them, because a CEO or a COO or a CFO isn't going to give you that kind of time allocation, but to just make them aware concisely that there's a large opportunity, and then get their guidance for who on their team you should partner with to get it done, and to seek their permission to just double back once every few weeks and let them know how the process is going. So those three are the three Bibles that I use, because if you take those together and get a rep to absorb it, you get an entirely different sales culture within the organization.
Yeah, those are amazing. If somebody took nothing but, hey, I'm going to go read those 3 books, that's a great pointer. Thanks to Mike for sharing that so much. Hey, another thing came to mind where you're talking about, hey, these books are telling a story that I believe in and that I value. Let's flip that around and go the other way. Is there something that you think conventional wisdom is pushing out there and saying whatever, but you don't necessarily agree with? So you're kind of going against the grain a little bit, like people are saying X, Y, Z, and you're like, my experience doesn't match that. Anything that jumps out at you as a typical suggestion or some guidance that maybe doesn't resonate with you or match up with your experience?
Yeah, no, especially as it relates to mid-market companies, there's an ideology out there that you just need to make a million touches and everything's going to go great. So just touch the eyeballs and let people know you exist. And really what that underlying message is create a lot of noise in the market and something will fall into your lap. And I kind of call that the shotgun approach instead of the rifle shot approach. I'd much rather take one careful shot using a telescopic sight and really take aim at a deal than just throw a bunch of messaging out into the universe and hope that somebody finds their way to me and gives my company money. And so I do think that this push towards using more science in sales, and really what you're trying to do is get your sales organization to do 70% of the work for your customer. I mean, I accidentally ended up meeting with the chief technology officer of General Motors years ago, and I didn't realize it was going to be him that I was calling on. They had just said, I'll be talking to an IT resource at General Motors. So I flew to Detroit and checked in, and all the secretaries were like, oh, you're meeting with Tony Scott. And I was like, who's Tony Scott? They said, he's the number 4 guy in the largest company in the world. And when I met with him, I said, listen, Tony, just got a few minutes, but I've given this some thought, and I believe putting myself in your shoes that strategically, this is why you'd want to have my SaaS package. And he said, you know what? You're only 70% right, but you've given this some thought. And so you are the right to have me tell you the 30% that you're not seeing correctly. And I'm going to do this deal with you. And ever since then, I've tried to train sales forces to do what I call carry the wood. It's like, put yourself in Rick's position. What does Rick need from my company? And when you present to Rick, try and make it obvious in a very concise way what it is we could do for him. And if you're not entirely right, he'll recognize that you're giving this some strategic thought, and he'll pick you as a partner because most of the other guys are just throwing stuff against the wall. So I really think that this whole sales and marketing approach where you just throw stuff against the wall and put it out there through Google and all that stuff, it's fine to get your day in front of folks. But when you get in front of folks, you really have to be thoughtful and strategic about why you were there, or you're not going to rise above the noise and you're just going to end up number 17 on their list of top 10 things they're going to do.
That's great. I really like that a lot. Hey, when I started Club E, the in-person sessions, my idea was to tell, share, teach somebody something over lunch and then have them go back to the office and do something different that day. I wanted to be very actionable. If you were to share one thing with an executive that they could take from this podcast and then go do something different the same day, what would that be?
I would just recommend that they treat their sales organization as a strategic resource. A lot of folks I've worked with, frankly, have said salespeople are just monkeys with briefcases. So we just need to give them the message, and they need to just go out and touch the world, and that's their job, and they're good at glad handing and so forth. And really, the science now is saying, no, you need to get your sales organization to use these repeatable processes to truly bring value through a solution selling approach, or you're just not going to rise above the noise. So whatever you need to do to start that conversation within your organization, you'll get 25 or 30% lift without really doing anything differently, just changing the culture. So that's the kind of thing I try and help folks with, and it's remarkable how often it works.
And then a wrapping up question a little bit as we aim to the finish line. If there's one thing that somebody took from this podcast today, what would that be?
Just consider the need to reevaluate how you're going to market so that you can more effectively rise above the noise. Because in sales, when you get teams of business development resources and so forth, and you say, hey, we need these guys to make 100 contacts a day and send these emails and so forth, that's all for naught if you can't get somebody to engage with you to understand your value. And so I think just really stepping back and saying our responsibility as a company is to find a way to, in a pinpointed way, get our value in front of folks and not just be part of this noise machine that's come from all the different Salesforce automation ways of doing campaigns and feeling good about the fact that you're making 150 touches a day, but you're touching people in a way that they just ignore because they couldn't possibly spend the time to understand your value.
Sure. I like that. Like that a lot. Hey, and then a little bit of a personal question to finish up on today. Asked this a lot at the Club E sessions and on these podcasts. What is one bit of business advice that you got that you wish you would have heard earlier in your career?
You know, that kind of phraseology I mentioned earlier, what I now call if I were you selling, that idea that I should spend time before I get with any executive and say, if I was going to be meeting with me today, what would I need to get from Mike to get maximum value from this discussion and choose him as a partner? And that approach has been so successful because A, it gets you halfway there just because you've given it some thought, and B, you'll be very surprised how often people respond well to that and say, you didn't get all the strategic thinking I would have applied to that, but I appreciate the fact that you got halfway there. So let's partner. And I'll tell you the other thing we need to do to go down this road together. So I wish I'd known that earlier in my career, because a lot of sales training is just say it and spray it, just spin it out and say as many words as you can until Rick says yes. And it's really just the opposite of that.
I like that. I like that a lot. Mike, thank you for joining us. Again, Mike Regnier is on our Club E podcast today talking about building a private equity ready revenue engine. Appreciated the background, appreciated the tips, appreciated your time. A lot of valuable nuggets here. So thank you very much.
No, honored to be part of your organization. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, but I look forward to seeing you up north this summer and look forward to having you again on our podcast.
No, perfect. Thanks, Rick. Appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, Mike.